In 1837, Protestant missionaries made their way to Japan. The country was not yet open to Christianity or pretty much to anyone outside of Japan. When the missionaries arrived, their focus was on aiding and supporting the people who were living in the country. But that focus began to turn in 1846 when their mission efforts began. And the missionaries came in order to not only provide support to those living in the country, but to proclaim the message of Jesus Christ in the nation. And the arrival of the missionaries and their growth became the main starting point for Tokyo Union Church, becoming a very key part of its history. Welcome to this edition of Tokyo Union Church, where the past informs the future. And in this edition, we're going to talk about how TUC was started in missions, but then grew in community and changed over time to focus on becoming a community church. Tokyo Union Church, as well as the Japanese church, according to one mission board, said that it was born in prayer. Back in January of 1872, the prayer meetings grew in interest and were continued from week to week. And after a week or two, the Japanese, according to this writing, saying that for the first time in the history of the nation, the Japanese were on their knees in a Christian prayer meeting, entreating God with great emotion, with the tears streaming down their faces, that He would give His Spirit to Japan. Now, we know that the hidden Christians existed 100 years before, and so whether it's the first time in the history of the nation or not, a little bit more debatable. But the point made here is the fact that there was this impact and this growth happening as the Japanese came to hear the message of Jesus Christ and were being impacted and transformed in the process. Through prayer, the Japanese church was born, and the Union Church was also born at this time. In 1872, there was a location set up over in Tsukiji, and that is when the Union Church began to have the gathering of weekly services. During that time, missionaries were the ones who primarily gathered on Sundays, and in the process, the church was not only made up mainly of missionaries, but also the missionaries served in leading the services, including the preachers that led every week. This was an important thing to note because Tokyo Union Church certainly doesn't look like that today. We have people who are professionals, business professionals, who are here on business, and those who may be in the diplomatic field. But it was a bit different back then. And in this particular report that was written a bit later into the early 1900s, Tokyo Union Church is largely known as a, quote, missionary church. And it was because it was attended by missionaries and it was being served by a missionary pastor. And in this note, it says that this is one of those factors that has made the Union Church unattractive from the point of view of the average layman. While this class of people are always welcomed, still the organization and makeup of the church and congregation are as to make them not feel at home. Tokyo was growing. After Japan opened up, people were coming in from overseas and they were looking for a church home, but Tokyo Union Church wasn't quite as welcoming because there were so many missionaries and it was being led by a missionary pastor. And the idea that there was no particular called pastor is something we can observe when we look at this copy of the TUC Constitution written sometime in the 1930s, or at least published sometime in the 1930s. Right here it talked about how Tokyo Union Church had this continued unbroken history. And during that time, there's no settled pastor. There's no permanent home. And it was in spite of this fact that during the greater part of its history, the weekly preaching was the voluntary service of its own members with no regular pastoral services except for a couple of times from 1960 to 1918 and the better part of the 1920s. But this period especially after 1902 to 1930, was a bit unsettled because there was no regular pastor except for a couple of times, and also there was no permanent location. And so we had a church that had many missionaries that eventually became a church that seemed to not know where it was going to be meeting. They had a few locations they would meet at, but it wasn't a place they would call home. And so it continued to contribute to this constantly moving type of feeling for the church, a tenant church, as it were. But things started to change by 1930 because at this point, a church had been built in what is now known as Montesando, and the same land is the current location of TUC today. And that's when people were able to gather together. And then in 1952, something else changed, where a pastor was called for the church. Reverend Galen Russell became the pastor of Tokyo Union Church, and it was also during this time that things had changed a bit at TUC. From the Mainichi newspaper in 1952, this is what the article talks about when it comes to TUC. It is one of a number of English-speaking community churches where English-speaking people congregate in answer to their business, professional, or diplomatic careers. Without a missionary emphasis toward the Japanese, the church serves the Tokyo-Yokohama English-speaking community. Notice a couple of big points here. It is focusing on how the people who are congregating came to Tokyo either on business or for professional reasons or for diplomatic careers. And therefore, we were no longer seeing all these missionaries gathering at TUC. But on top of that, we see that there is not a missionary emphasis toward the Japanese. It is focused on the English-speaking community. So obviously, changes had happened over a few decades, being started with a group of missionaries gathering together for worship to a focus on those who were coming to Tokyo to live and to work. But it's not that TUC lost its focus on missions or its witness for Christ. When we look just a few years later, with the next pastor, Pastor Howard Haynes, taking lead of Tokyo Union Church as the pastor, we see this note that he writes, talking about how Protestant Christians have been in Japan for 100 years, and it was during that time where they faced persecution and ridicule and endured failure, suffered war devastation, labored, prayed, achieved impressive success, and strongly aided in the renewal of this nation. And so Pastor Haynes, stating that TUC is a part of the Church of Christ in Japan, calls the Christians of this land of November 1st would be a day of rededication to the still unfinished task of Christ. As these Protestant Christians strongly aided in the renewal of this nation, there was also a part of that the witness for Christ and testifying to the gospel message of Jesus. So we see here that TUC, even though it was not filled with missionaries as it was when it was first started, there's still this important work of Christ that is still taking place at TUC. And that's very important for us to observe as we consider this history and how it impacts us today. Here's a funny little tidbit that I did notice in this memo as well. There were 3 services at the time, 9 and 11 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. And there's this little side note saying, may I recommend the 9 o'clock service? 11 o'clock is getting pretty crowded. Apparently, 11 o'clock was not only a popular time for us now, but also back in the day as well. So, as we wrap up this particular video, the question that we want to discuss and consider is how the past, where we see TUC gathered by missionaries, transformed into a community church where, yes, it's still witnessing for Christ in Tokyo. How does it lead us into the future in how we serve the community? Because we do have the pillar, one of the pillars, saying that we are integrated into community. How should that impact our involvement in the community and here at TUC? I do want to give a couple of things here. A lot of the information from both the presentation on the TUC buildings as well as today comes from a Church for All Seasons by Robert Hemphill. And also, I want to give a special thanks to Allison Yamaguchi, who has worked so much the resources and provided us with a lot of those pictures and of the primary documents that you saw in today's presentation. So I want to give a big thanks to her. I hope you have a fruitful discussion today.